Thomas Moran is an American painter with an international reputation. This 19th century painter is best known for his landscapes of the American West. These are paintings that have stirred the hearts of countless Americans, and paintings that were for many a major inspiration as they started to move to the West. The collection of Morans at Gilcrease Museum is second to none. I'm Barbara Cohenauer. Please stay tuned as Focus on Art visits Gilcrease for a look at Thomas Moran. My guest today is Anne Moran. Anne is the curator of art collections and has just finished a book on Thomas Moran. Hi, Anne.
Hi.
Welcome to Focus on Art.
Barbara.
Nice to have you here. We have to ask the first question first. Everyone that I've talked to wants to know if Anne Moran is related to Thomas Moran.
No, I would love to say that I am, but unfortunately I'm not. It's spelled a little differently, but I'll claim it anytime I can.
Okay, well now that we've cleared up our first question, of course I think there's no American artist whose reputation is any more widely known than Thomas Moran.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about this artist.
He was one of the many immigrants who came to the United States during the early part of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. His family had been weavers in England and relocated to the Philadelphia area to take advantage of opportunities there in the Industrial Revolution. And he showed interest in art as a child, as did many of his siblings, and his parents were very encouraging. And the Philadelphia area was a perfect place for artists. There was lots of support for it. Mm-hmm. And so as a young man, instead of going into weaving the way his parents had done, he studied art. He was apprenticed to a wood engraving firm and then worked on watercolors in his own time, and then really set out to be a fine artist at a very young age. He set this as a goal for himself. And by the time he was in his early 30s, he had achieved that, and then built his career from that. So.
Okay, and of course I think we all know him best for his paintings of the American West. However, if a visitor comes to Gilcrease, the very first Moran they see is this one that's over your shoulder.
Yes. The first introduction one gets is this wonderful scene of ice, obviously, and Moran was very interested in how nature manifests itself within man's world and how overpowering it often could be. And so this is, although unusual, is not really out of keeping with the types of things Moran would have created. Even in his most austere paintings of nature, though, he always included some reference to the human existence, and we see a little bit of flotsam here from a shipwreck in the foreground, and it's actually a literary reference to the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. There's the albatross and then the mast of the ship there. So, but of course, the rest of our collection is really more specifically related to his Western experience, and that's what most Americans are interested in. So.
Right. Well, now this painting would be then from really the
later period
mm-hmm. of his life.
Right. Right. Okay. After he was a well-established painter with a national and international reputation.
Okay. As I look at this particular painting, Anne, it seems to me like I see some influence of Turner in that.
Yes.
Was Moran familiar with Turner?
Yes, he was. In fact, he took a trip to England in 1861 when he was in his teens, specifically to study the work of Turner. He had seen Turner's work as part of exhibitions that were brought to Philadelphia and Boston, New York during the early or the mid-century time. But he was also familiar with Turner's work through engravings, which of course were black and white. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't until he actually had a chance to see Turner in the flesh, as it were, in England, in London, that he was, you see him really responding to Turner's work. And he spent over a year not only studying the work that was available, but traveling around to all the sites that Turner had visited in England, mm-hmm. and sort of making his own experience based on what his artistic hero had done before him. And so we see a lot of this coming out in his work all through his career. Barbara, in addition to the isolated painting in the hallway, we also have an entire gallery of the museum devoted to the work of Thomas Moran. Most of the things that are in the gallery here are things that Gilcrease acquired from the estate of Thomas Moran, things that Moran kept, and then after his death, his daughter also kept, because they were important to her as they had been to his father.
Well, it seems to me, from the artists that I know personally, they always keep their favorite things.
Yes.
So what we're really going to see today are the favorite works
Yes.
of Thomas Moran.
Yes, yes.
Wonderful.
Well, we'll start with one of the very early pieces that Moran created. This was prior to his introduction to the work of William Turner in London, although he had known him before. This is a work, an allegorical or religious subject of the flight into Egypt, and unusual when one thinks of an artist again devoted to the work of the American West. But allegorical and religious subjects were very popular. They continue to be today in various formats. But this very detailed kind of presentation is something that Moran would move away from as he became more sophisticated as an artist. Young artists often feel compelled to include a tremendous amount of detail in order to tell their story successfully. Here we have the Holy Family, Jesus and Mary and the infant and Joseph, as well as pyramids in the background. You can see them back over here. And then lots of vegetation, ferns and trees and vines and things like that. So Moran's own personal conception of what the Orient, what Egypt would have looked like. Luckily, though, for us who prefer a more realistic approach, he did move into a realm that includes what area that was his present-day rural Pennsylvania. And this is a scene of the Catawissa Valley, the Susquehanna River, which is in rural Pennsylvania. It's hard for us to imagine today. Many of our eastern states had a lot of wilderness, and so Moran did not have to go very far away from his home of Philadelphia in order to find areas that were wild and built up, and that's what he was able to find here. In Moran's youth, the building of the railroad and the expansion of the railroad across America was a very important aspect of cultural development, and so we see his interest in the railroad in a lot of his paintings, and of course here it is in the background. The painting is also more detailed still at this point. This is also about 1861 or 1862, either just after or just before he goes to England. So we still see that he is still a little caught up in detail, but this is, as you can see, is much less so than the flight into Egypt.
Right, these two paintings look very much like early 19th century painting.
Yes.
And if he had kept in this style, he would have probably just been another painter, but it was that ability to move on.
That's right. And also some wonderful occurrences that happened, some just things opportunities that he happened to be available for. For example, within 10 years he goes to the Yellowstone, and we have a whole wall here devoted to images from the Yellowstone area.
Well, these certainly remind me of the Yellowstone I took my daughter to visit a few years ago. I don't think it's changed, Ann.
It hasn't, has it? It's a real testament to the power of the image. Moran has given us his own recollection of an area that he visited first in 1871 as a member of the government's survey party. These were painted the year after he returned in the studio, based on his own recollections, field sketches, and also black and white photographs that were taken by the expedition's photographer. But what Moran has done, and what an artist can do better than anyone else, is condense images so that we're getting a more complete picture in a small format than we would otherwise. For example, in this painting called Wyoming Falls, the Yellowstone River, which shows the lower falls, he has given us a view that one can only actually see by looking upriver and turning around and looking downriver. But in doing so has given us a much better idea of what the entire area looks like. And we don't look at it as false. People who have been there many times still accept this as actuality. And Moran wasn't intending to fool anybody, but to give us the best possible character of the area that he could in such a small format.
So basically what he's doing is the same thing we might do with a videotape.
Certainly.
And that is he's giving us a pan around and then condensed it into
That's
one
right.
painting.
And certain tricks that he uses as a watercolorist, and I use the word tricks in the best possible sense, is that he's doing things that mimic our true vision. The camera appears to give us a very true idea of things, but it doesn't really, because the camera has one eye and we have two. So we get a different kind of stereoscopic view. Moran knew this, and even though he used photographs in a lot of the preparatory work for paintings such as these, he was able to call on his own experience and understanding of optics and optical experience to do things such as soften the edges of a painting like this to mimic peripheral vision. Because as you know, your view softens as the field is larger. And so you get in this very small format. This is what, 8 by 10? You get a feeling of an enormous space that stretches on for hundreds of miles, and you believe it. You know, you're not feeling that you're in this little claustrophobic area at all.
Right.
And this was one of the real strengths of Thomas Moran as a watercolorist.
So this is really more real than what I would get if I
Yes,
went out there and stood on
absolutely.
that mountaintop with my camera.
Absolutely.
Amazing.
This wonderful image of the Yellowstone River, again, is a rather false image because, although not false in a bad sense, what Moran has done in this particular instance is he has reduced the image. He has picked out certain elements for the foreground that give us the feeling of the wilderness, and he's erased out the superfluous, the clutter that actually exists in a wilderness area that's overgrown, has lots of timber and natural trash, kind of. And he's just given us this very subdued vision of what is the best possible aspect of this lake area of the Yellowstone River. The paper itself was brown, so he was able to use not only translucent color in the greens and the blues, but he adds opaque white for very crisp high tones that would not be, you wouldn't easily achieve otherwise in watercolor work.
And it seems to me like, from what you're saying, that Thomas Moran was a very well-educated artist.
Yes, self-taught, but he had a good eye and a good memory, and retained a lot of information, not only information that he was accepting from other artists, because he was part of a large group of artists and photographers, family members as well as others, but he also was in the company, in this case, of scientists. The expedition was made up of scientists, and he retained a lot of information that he was able to acquire through just his association with them that entire summer, and then translated into this. Very sophisticated work. He was 34 years old. That's today perhaps that's not too young for a mature artist, but in those days, the days of the late Hudson River School concepts, that was very young for an artist. We're not seen as real mature at that point. So, but these are highly mature works at a time when watercolor was not an acceptable exhibiting medium.
Right. Okay.
Moran's interest in the Yellowstone continued, even though he wouldn't visit for another 21 years. And this painting, for example, again of the Lower Falls area, was painted in 1893 when he returned. So we see that it's an enduring subject for him, and one probably that most people who know Moran associate him with.
And as we look at this, I think we can certainly see the color of Turner. I think we can see that influence.
It really becomes so evident in his later work, and it's very interesting because the world of art is changing tremendously, and this is the start of Moran being considered a little old-fashioned, although still very well loved by the public. Of course, this is after the French Impressionists, and we do see a little influence. The French Impressionists would influence everyone, whether they acknowledged it or not. And so we see a little of that kind of thing in paint application and some brushwork, but certainly not the lightening of the palette and the minimalizing of this grandiose scene, that an Impressionist would have painted if one had been so moved to paint something like this.
Well, it's a wonderful painting.
Barbara, let's see some of the other things that Moran did during his career. As we walk through the gallery, you can get some sense of how large the collection is and the space that we've devoted to its presentation.
Well, it certainly exhibits the depth of the collection. It's just wonderful, Anne.
Well, speaking of depth, This whole wall is devoted to works that are normally not considered something people think of when they think of Moran, and that these are images that he created after a trip to Mexico. He went to Mexico in 1883, landing at Veracruz, represented by this painting, which was the jumping off point, really. You could take a steamer from New York to Veracruz and then on to other spots. And then to go inland, you rode the train, and that's what Moran did. But this beautiful port with its lovely cathedral was something that was very special to Moran. It spoke to him of Venice, which he hadn't visited yet, and it was a place that he equated very strongly with this Oriental port. And I say Oriental in the terms of the exotic was very important to these 19th century painters, and they saw Venice as this tie between the Orient and Europe. But this was as close as Moran could get at this point, and we see rather Venetian-looking vessels here in the foreground. The other thing I want to point out about this painting, I really love this. It shows that an artist is very much a product of his own time. The island volcano Krakatoa had erupted, and the eruption was so violent that it threw so much debris into the upper atmosphere that for years, I don't know how long, maybe even decades after the eruption, sunsets were highly colored, almost pyrotechnics, and the artists who painted landscapes and used the late evening hours or the late afternoon hours, most of their skies are wildly colored like this, and without knowing that, one would look at this and think that the artist had gone a little mad with his color, but he's painting what he is experiencing. And then
the same kind of thing we're seeing today.
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
Now, he also painted more subdued images that are very reminiscent of the French painter Camille Corot. Corot was one of the early experimenters with tones, perhaps that had not been used prior to his time. He was one of loosely connected to the artist who's loosely connected to the Barbizon school, right. And so he gave us lots of images of French peasants dancing in the countryside. And so this image of a Mexican fiesta is it gives us a real feeling for the influence of Corot on this artist. And in fact, Moran visited with Corot when he went to Paris in 1867, and so and went to the Forest of Fontainebleau, which is one of the places that the Barbizon painters. So again, 20 years later, we see that influences but continue to pop up in an artist's life, especially one who's very open and receptive to such things.
Well, actually, this whole corner right here, you could cut that out and hang it in a French museum and say, this is an example of the Barbizon school.
And people would believe it.
And people would believe that.
Right. That's right. It's
really very interesting.
Moran was also struck with archaeological ruins. This is the Tower of Cortes in the central part. It's odd things sort of sticking up in the natural landscape. We see Moran doing this not often, but enough that we know that he was taken with the idea of man's progress and downfall as compared with the continuation of nature. And he's given us this rather unusual vertical image. Moran didn't do too many oils in a vertical format because he was much more interested in this large panoramic experience really with his paintings. But certainly it's in keeping with the subject that he has done here.
You know, Anne, one thing I might say to our viewers too, when you come out and you look at the Morans, I think everybody has a tendency to stand back because of the expanse of the landscape and so forth. But these are wonderfully interesting paintings as far as the brush work, the application of paint. You might go into an area like this right here. It's amazing. The layering of the color, the impasto and so forth. So they're wonderful to look at up close as well as stand back and enjoy the landscape.
And that again is part of an artist's genius, to give a very multidimensional experience to those who view the work. Certainly someone who's interested in geology can find something to love. Someone who's simply interested in the surface of a painting can find something to love. And it's really just a matter of finding what suits you and focusing on it. Or then the overall experience, of course, is important.
They're just wonderful.
Oh, excuse me. Another image, of course, that's a perennial favorite with visitors and was also with Moran was the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River. This is a late conception that he came up with, 1913, but Moran's exposure to the Grand Canyon was in 1873, again, as with Yellowstone, with a government survey. But it was the Grand Canyon that would prove to be an enduring site to visit, as well as subject for painting with Moran, because it was very easy to get to. There was a railroad terminus that came within a few miles of it, and then eventually there was an actual station at the Grand Canyon, and there were hotels, and it was a very easy place to visit. But as you can see, Moran chose not to show any of the aspects of any tourism or any industrial, anything else involved within the industry of tourists, and has focused on, of course, some aspect of this wilderness area. This is a late painting of Moran's in which we see him combining many of the things that were successful in earlier works. Very atmospheric, rather elemental area here in the center, showing this very deep space recession. You can see that the brushwork is very soft. There's not a lot of impasto, none whatsoever. The colors are very misty. And then here in this foreground area, the rocks that give us a position for the viewer. We know where to stand, where we're standing as viewers, are painted in a much more descriptive fashion, perhaps. We have a feeling for the character of the types of rocks and the individual forms of vegetation that he encountered. And so you can almost cut this painting up with your mind and get a whole catalog of Moran's different techniques and interests in something like this. With this painting, I also want to point out something that's important about Moran and other Victorian painters. The framing of a work was as critical as the presentation of the painting itself, or the surface of the painting. It was part of the presentation. And this highly ornate, beautifully handmade article of furniture, really, was Moran's own design and executed by a master frame maker there in New York, where he lived, to finish off this painting. Now, our contemporary eyes, our late 20th century eyes, might not respond to this kind of presentation, but it's important, I think, in a cultural institution to keep the artist in mind instead of ourselves. What the artist intended, not what we think he should have done, because certainly modes change, styles change, and conceptions change. But this one is quite lovely, I think, no matter whose eyes you're using.
Now, Anne, is this carved out of wood and then gilded?
Yes, it has, and some of the areas are built up with plaster. So some of these high areas around the frame are some plaster casting that then is then gilded. But the main support is wood. It's quite heavy.
Okay. It's absolutely fantastic.
Isn't it beautiful? Yeah. Of course, Moran didn't feel the necessity to put that ornate a frame on everything that he created. This wonderful painting of the Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico is much more subdued when compared with the earlier one. The Southwest was another area that Moran delved for subject matter, although pretty late in his career. He visited the Pueblos in the 1880s, but most of his paintings come from the turn of the century. Again, on his trips to the Grand Canyon, it was a short ride over to many of the Pueblo regions, even Acoma. He was very taken with this majestic village perched on top of the rocks, and would often include in the foreground images of riders going toward it. But again, an interesting oddity about Moran's work. These look more like Arab horsemen than Native American riders, and mostly because Moran was not a good figure painter, or perhaps he just wasn't interested enough in the figure to work on it that much. And so he's simply given us a general exotic figure that's riding toward this, because the overall view was much more important than any particular individual element of his painting.
Well, Moran really is a landscape painter.
Yes, yes. So we will forgive him the figures.
Absolutely. Now, I've been here.
Oh, this is another of the Yellowstone, yes. It's painted the same year that the larger Yellowstone falls that we saw. This is the formation at the Mammoth Hot Springs. This would continue to be fascinating not only to Moran, but all visitors. The formations themselves are always changing. They're very soft. They're not permanent. You can go from year to year, and they're always formations, but the shapes and the configuration will change from time to time as erosion occurs and more deposits. And so with this very subdued and soft, rather unfocused vision of that area, he has given us the idea of the impermanence of it. And Moran was thinking about these things. These aren't accidental occurrences. He was considering how best to show the character of a place, and matched his execution of work of a particular subject to the way he particularly felt about it.
He was really a very scientific thinker.
I think so, without being a scientist. He was
That's
much
right.
more romantic but he approached things in a very methodical, very scientific way, philosophical way too.
This is wonderful.
This absolutely phenomenal painting that we are fortunate to have is probably the most unusual statement that this artist could make. It is so many things. It's a statement about conservation, about natural conservation. It's a statement about loss and depression. He painted it right after his beloved wife died. The conservation statement I alluded to is this is in Idaho, and he found out that there was going to be some clear cutting of the Idaho forests, and because nobody thought there was anything in Idaho worth preserving, and so he visited and saw Shoshone Falls, that's what this subject is, and painted this as a statement against that. It's also just a statement about rebirth and renewal. There's evidence of a waterfall, of a rainbow over the waterfall, which is a natural occurrence where spray is, but it's also a romantic symbol, both in literature as well as art, of rebirth and renewal. There are lots of things going on in this painting. Moran did not sell this painting. He attempted to. He wanted the enormous sum of $10,000 for the painting and was never able to get that. It was painted in 1900, which is getting toward the end of his career. And as you know, by 1900 we have tremendous changes in the art world. And so this was not seen as the type of work that people would want to acquire at that kind of price. Lucky for us. That's why we ended up with it. And of course now it's seen as one of the real treasures in Moran's work.
I went to the Shoshone Falls because I wanted to see what they look like, because I was so accustomed to this painting.
And you didn't see it, did you?
Well, yes, the day I was there, the falls,
they had water in it. That's
the
great.
falls were running, and the sky was the same. It was a wonderful experience. It was like going home.
It's very rare because the Corps of Engineers has dammed up the Snake River, and so it's very unusual to see it like this.
Okay, we have just a few more paintings on this last wall over here.
We're looking at the final years of his career.
And how old was Thomas Moran when he did these paintings?
Well, this seascape was painted when he was 87. He died when he was 89, so you can see that he's active all the way up to the end of his life. Painters seem to be long-lived. I think it has something to do with that particular spark of life that they have. But this is a particularly nice painting, representative of those later years, that shows his departure from the absolute reality that he had dealt with for so much in most of his career. And what a lovely swan song, perhaps.
Right. Thank you, Ann. We appreciate your being here.
Loved having you. Thank you.
For those of you at home, we appreciate your being with us, as always, for Focus on Art.